At the Bride Hunt Ball. Written by Olivia Parker. In loving memory, my grandmother, Celia Garzinski, 1921 to 1992. And for my mom, my rescuer, my therapist, my audience, my friend, my inspiration. Chapter 1.
Don't fret, my dear. Perhaps one day you'll blossom into a beauty like my Harriet.
Miss Madelyn Haywood nibbled on her bottom lip as she weighed her choices. She could scream, making a frenzied dash for the French doors in the adjoining room, or she could retain her composure and nod agreeably.
Thank you,
Madelyn replied. Politeness won.
Oh, don't look so forlorn.
Lady Beauchamp waved her fan vigorously in a vain attempt to mask a belch. Her aunt's stale breath was a clear indication the woman was good and foxed.
There are still 2 more cards to be presented, yes? You could be so fortunate. It said miracles happen all the time.
She started to giggle, but a hiccup cut her short.
Let me assure you I haven't the slightest inclination to receive one.
Madelyn lifted her chin and pretended to look about the room.
Oh dear,
Lady Beauchamp exclaimed, closing her fan with a snap.
that's why you're here, why we're all here. What great fun is this? Just think, soon even you could have a chance to be a duchess.
Using her fan, her aunt made a stabbing gesture toward 4 young ladies chatting excitedly by the foot of a grand staircase.
Look at them, smiling like simpletons. If my dear Harriet hadn't just received an invitation to the ball, I'd think they were deliberately flashing their cards so that I might see. What an atrocious display! Such a lack of decorum!
Madelyn gave a short nod in response. Though anxious to quit her aunt's company, she prayed her association with her father's sister would forestall any strange possibility that either of the Devine brothers should come near. Lady Beauchamp had a habit of imbibing large amounts of wine at social functions, really, at any function save breakfast, and people seemed to avert their gazes, deftly avoiding the loud, opinionated woman as if she were a knot of rats. Madelyn rose on the tips of her slippered feet, hoping to spot her friend amidst the crush of guests.
Aunt Lucinda, do you see Miss Green?
Do you mean to say Miss Charlotte Green? Good heavens, she's here! However does her mother think her scrawny, milk-and-water miss would ever land an invitation to his Grace's estate? Oh, I pity the girl and her mother, for they will certainly walk away this evening disappointed. Charlotte Green, you say?
Her aunt tossed back her head, bursting into unladylike guffaws. Incensed, Madelyn opened her mouth to defend her friend when the ostrich plumes tucked inside the folds of her aunt's blue turban tickled the nose of the gentleman standing behind her. He erupted into a sneeze, then glared at the back of the Viscountess's head. He was still looking at her thus when her aunt turned around, apparently to see what had collided with her headwear. Madelyn stifled a small grin, satisfied the gentleman managed to give her aunt a scornful glare, encapsulating all of what Madelyn needed to say in defense of her dear friend. The stout woman slurred her apology, then promptly excused herself from Madelyn's company with a swish of her skirts. She watched her aunt wander directly into the very crowd of young women she'd just admonished, no doubt to find some other young lady to perk up. After a brief inspection of the room's occupants, Madelyn located her stepmother, arms linked with Lady Beauchamp's Harriet. She made a wide arc around the pair as she passed, putting scores of guests between them. She felt her stepmother's arctic glare prickling the back of her head as she slipped into the adjoining room. In the ballroom, she was about to give up hope of ever finding her friend when she spotted Charlotte, executing her best impression of a tea rose on the hand-painted Chinese wallpaper at her back. As Madelyn made her way through the sea of people, talk of the Duke and his brother rippled around her.
Such a scandalous way to find a wife for the presumptive heir, don't you agree? All those innocent ladies locked away with the Devine men for a fortnight.
Very clever of the old wolf. Wish I thought of it first.
Strange he isn't taking a bride himself and wants his brother to carry on the family line.
I say it's damned unfair. He's likely to choose only the best of the lot for his brother, leaving only the seasoned nags for us to pick from.
Seasoned nags? She turned and gave the man who uttered that particular phrase a good glare. This being her 4th season, Madelyn thought she could pen a novel cataloguing the names of all the crafty rakes and pompous heirs she'd come across. Naturally, at the top of her list of insufferable men would be the brothers Devine. Arrogance and wickedness never before blended to form such tempting packages. For in the heart of every romantic female of the Tarn lurked the secret desire to spark the interest of one of the proud Devines. Of course, it helped that they were members of one of the wealthiest, most ancient lineages in all of England, with Lord Tristan's wicked recklessness and the Duke of Wolverest's brooding arrogance. Eager mammas looking to marry off their hopeful debutantes rallied to the challenge. Unfortunately for them, the Devines' questionable pursuits didn't include virgins or marriage. Until now. However, Madelyn was no fool. She could well imagine the brothers held this ball for some darker purpose. She knew men like them well, the sort who gave little more care to a woman's heart than they did the roast pheasant they had enjoyed for dinner. Lord Rothbury was one, and her stepmother had ordered her to accept it along with the Earl's proposal last season. Madelyn had flatly refused. She had been locked in the wine cellar for a day as punishment. It would have been longer had their butler quit sampling the Haywood's stock of spirits, as he had promised. Charlotte smiled as Madelyn approached.
Clever girl. I didn't think you'd ever leave your aunt's side.
Yes, and you could have used her as a shield of sorts as well. Your companionship would have lessened my suffering.
Madelyn teased. Telltale red splotches bloomed on Charlotte's cheeks and neck. Her smile faltered and her gaze dropped to the floor.
Is something wrong?
Madelyn asked, knowing Charlotte had high hopes of receiving an invitation to Wolverest Castle. Perhaps she was now feeling the effects of rejection. The poor dear, Madelyn thought when her friend answered, only with a tiny shake of her head. She was quite sure Charlotte would make a suitable wife for any man, just not Lord Tristan. Unfortunately, Charlotte considered herself half in love with the pompous rake already, along with every other romantic lady of marriageable age. A flash of crumbled white peeked out of Charlotte's fist. Madelyn's brow rose.
What's that you're holding?
Oh, 'tis nothing.
Charlotte looked up but failed to meet Madelyn's gaze.
Did you know Wolverest Castle is in Yorkshire? I don't know exactly where, but not far from West Burton. My mother said. Perhaps near your mother's cottage.
Indeed.
She gave a short nod.
Willowbrook is on the outskirts of the Wolverest estate. Speaking of our host, midnight is nigh upon us and I haven't seen his grace, though I doubt I'd recognise him anyway.
Quite.
Charlotte nodded her agreement. Between the both of them, they were only marginally acquainted with Lord Tristan. And as for the Duke of Wolverest, not at all. When his grace came to town for the parliamentary session, he only attended a scattering of highborn functions to which Madelyn would never in 100 years find herself invited. Which suited her fine. She certainly didn't need another stuffy aristocrat wagging his finger at her for her lack of sophistication.
To be sure, I'm beginning to think his grace isn't here at all,
Madelyn remarked with a touch of hope.
Well, he has only 2 more ladies to invite to his castle, and then this horrid evening will finally be over.
There's only one more left now.
Charlotte pressed her lips together so hard they turned white.
Oh?
Madelyn prompted, curious about Charlotte's odd reaction to her query.
Did you see who she was? Do we know her?
No, I'm not certain.
Charlotte stammered, suddenly finding sincere interest in something across the room. She cleared her throat delicately to garner Charlotte's flagging attention.
To think he has his sister and his solicitor pick the potential brides,
she said, widening her eyes.
Scandalous, wouldn't you agree?
Charlotte didn't answer, so Madelyn followed her friend's line of vision. Across the room, a young woman sat plucking an enchanting melody on a harp, though the hum of conversation nearly drowned out the sound. Still, Madelyn suspected there must be something other than a harpist holding her friend in this state of distraction. Behind the musician, Lady Rosalind leaned down to speak with the Duke's solicitor. Acting as hostess for her brothers, Lady Rosalind had swept from guest to guest, making light conversation throughout the evening. After speaking with the solicitor, she would disappear for short periods, slipping through a pair of tall doors underneath the sweeping staircase. It was then Mr. Ashton would present the next invitation. As there were to be 7 potential brides, there was only one invitation left. Perhaps Lady Rosalind was consulting with her brothers. Madelyn imagined they lounged in their private rooms, sipping claret as they waited for their sister to return and divulge just who their next unwitting victim was to be. She shuddered visibly.
Are you unwell?
Charlotte asked with concern.
Just my cursed imaginings, 'tis all.
Madelyn murmured, returning her gaze to Lady Rosalind and the messenger of doom. She observed the pair until Lady Rosalind excused herself from Mr. Ashton's company after casting a glance in her and Charlotte's direction. The Duke's sister smiled briefly, then exited through the tall doors under the grand staircase. If the pattern held true, there would be another invitation presented shortly. The tension in her shoulders eased as a wave of relief washed over her. The evening would be over soon. Her stepmother would surely make a fuss and declare her lack of enthusiasm as the reason she wasn't chosen. But perhaps there was a chance she could manage to persuade her way into travelling to Yorkshire with Aunt Lucinda and Harriet, with the both of them preoccupied with the hope that Harriet would catch the interest of the younger Devine. She could plan an early return to Willowbrook Cottage. Husbandless, yes, but her heart would remain her own.
He's staring at you.
Madelyn looked up and caught the solicitor's gaze. Mr. Ashton's smile resembled the starry-eyed gape of a besotted fool. He straightened the spectacles on his thin nose without breaking eye contact. Indeed, he was staring. A knot of dread as heavy as a cannonball dropped in the pit of her stomach.
It's quite unnerving, isn't it?
Madelyn struggled to keep her voice sounding bored and disinterested.
He very well could be staring at you.
I hardly think so.
Charlotte giggled.
I've been watching him for several moments. I believe he's on his way over.
You're jesting with me?
Madelyn asked with swelling panic. She looked to where Mr. Ashton once stood and found him gone. Her eyes skimmed the crowd for a moment until she spied him weaving through the guests. He held a white note card to his chest, his eyes flashing with what she assumed was anticipation of the recipient's elated swoon.
Oh dear, this cannot be happening.
Don't panic. Just graciously accept the invitation like everyone else.
Charlotte offered.
I must say, Maddie, you're my dearest friend, but I don't quite understand why you wouldn't want to attend. It's wildly eccentric and all very exciting.
It's arrogant madness.
Madelyn looked left then right without turning her head as she weighed the easiest route of escape. Guests loomed everywhere, their gazes locked on the solicitor and his progress across the room. Her heart thudded madly within her chest. She couldn't very well burst through the swell of people. She'd be caught swiftly by Mr. Ashton for sure. She was well and truly trapped unless... She turned, her gaze drawn to the candlelight's luminous reflection on the French doors at her far left.
Let's split up. I'll try losing him by running into the garden. If 'tis me he's targeting, he'd never think to find me there standing amidst a downpour.
She didn't wait to see if Charlotte chose to flee or not. Instead, she dashed toward the rain-streaked glass doors, taking an indirect route around a row of potted lemon trees, marking the entrance to the conservatory. Realizing too late that she'd walked herself into a corner, she plucked one of the hard balls of unripe fruit as she raced past. She pushed mightily against the door of the conservatory, losing precious seconds before realizing it pulled open instead.
Miss Haywood!
Mr. Ashton called out, panting.
Miss Haywood, I beg you, wait!
With one last glance over her shoulder at the nearing solicitor, she ducked inside the humid room. Zigzagging around rows of exotic blooms, she nearly crashed into a small fountain with a water-spitting frog in its centre. Rounding it, her feet skittered on the smooth floor, panic creeping in as she realised there might not be another exit. But in another moment she spied a fogged glass door across the room. Fairly flying, she sprinted to the other side, praying it would open to the garden. Reaching it, she yanked the door open and flung herself outside. She looked over her shoulder and breathed a sigh of relief. Ashton was no longer in sight. Only his muted shouts proclaimed he still hadn't given up chase. She didn't care if she was making a scene. She was leaving this mansion tonight secure with the decision she would no longer do her stepmother's bidding. She would not waste any more time chasing after titled men with hefty account ledgers and insatiable appetites for young flesh, just to appease her stepmother. She would live her life the way she deemed fit, alone with her memories at Willowbrook Cottage. Thankfully, the rain had taken a respite, but the flashes of lightning nearby declared there would be another bout of rain and wind ahead. Upon hearing the door of the conservatory creak open, her hope sank. Apparently, Mr. Ashton was as persistent in his pursuit of the fairer sex as was his employer. She spied a flagstone path which disappeared somewhere underneath a curtain of branches of a willow tree. She headed for the cover it would provide. Glancing down at the knot of fruit in her palm, she tossed it in the air and caught it swiftly, her lips curling into an impish smile. At least she had a weapon. Gabriel Devine, the 7th Duke of Wolverest, rested a hip against the balcony railing, his arms crossed over his chest. Looking down into the shadowed garden, he inhaled the scent of wet earth and exhaled it on a low growl. The rumblings of conversation merged with the soft thrum of plucked harp strings, the sound rising from the open French doors of the ballroom beneath his rooms. He shook his head in disgust. 20 highly desirable ladies down there, only 7 of whom would be singled out to audition for the bride of Devine. It would be quite the miracle, Gabriel mused, if the evening concluded without producing a scattering of catfights. They were all very keen on marrying into his family. Silly creatures. If only they realized what a fool's heart Tristan possessed. Gabriel had gone to great lengths composing a list of eligible ladies of impeccable beauty, decorum, and wit from which his younger brother would choose a bride. It was a nearly impossible feat, as Gabriel lost several early candidates to marriage along the way. It took nearly a year to finish the ever-changing list, with the assistance of his sister and his aging spinster aunt, who lorded over their affairs as the self-appointed voice of cultivated reason. During this time, Gabriel struggled to convince straight-from-Oxford Tristan that he must marry, produce heirs, and maintain the family dukedom, for Gabriel himself wouldn't marry. He knew he simply did not have the compulsion to inflict that sort of aggravation on a woman. After all, he expected nothing less than perfection, and such a creature didn't exist. And even if she did, he thought it highly probable that the very flawlessness that first attracted him to any future bride would turn him into a bored, resentful beast in his married life. The thought of sending his wife to waste away the hours at some obscure property, forgotten, lonely, and unwanted, filled him with a very real, very familiar uneasiness. His mother had been such a woman, and he still harboured a bitter resentment toward his father for the emotional torment that man had created. A door slammed in the distance, followed by a string of muffled shouts.
Miss Haywood! Miss Haywood! Pray, halt!
A wisp of pale yellow fabric flickered down below, followed by a feminine gasp. Someone was in his garden, and that someone was decidedly female. And, as it appeared, she was being chased. If he didn't know that Tristan at the last possible minute decided to await the arrival of the party in Yorkshire, he'd have assumed his brother had lured one of their female guests into the shadows. But who would wander in the rain-soaked garden? The ground was surely saturated, quick to ruin silk shoes and the hems of dinner gowns. A dark cloud released the full moon, casting silvery blue light behind the mansion. He winced as the figure tripped and fell over the same uneven flagstone he had stumbled over this morning on his way to his favourite spot to read the morning paper. Gingerly, she brought herself to her knees with a mild curse. Gabriel's scowl deepened. Standing, she looked over her shoulder toward the doors of the ballroom, the light revealing her face. She seemed of average prettiness, he guessed, Dark hair and pale skin were the only details he could discern in the shadows. A sudden, obliging gust of wind plastered her gown to her curves. One dark eyebrow lifted as Gabriel contemplated the curve of her hips and backside. She was narrow-waisted and small, but one wouldn't describe her as skin on bones. From his vantage point above her, he could hardly deny noticing the deep valley between her breasts. Voluptuous. Yes, that was it. She was voluptuous. He had always preferred small breasts on a woman. A shout rang out. The girl jumped, looked about, then slipped under the cover of the sweeping branches of a willow tree. To his amazement, a man who looked quite like his solicitor came sprinting across the courtyard, slipping to a halt in the mud. His mood darkening further, Gabriel braced his hands on the banister, leaning over to get a better look.
"You're not thinking of jumping, are you?"
Gabriel's sister called out from behind him. He straightened with a crooked grin.
"With my luck, I'd only break an arm."
"I worry this will not go as planned."
Rosalind warned.
"Tristan might enjoy this too much."
"The young pup's more likely to imitate me and waste the entire time finding fault with them all and end up choosing no one."
"But what about you?"
She heaved a frustrated sigh when he didn't answer.
"You, dear brother, are incredibly stubborn. I know we have talked about this at least 100 times before, but I had hoped you would change your mind. Why do you insist on being unmarried?"
He rubbed his brow, growing irritated with this vein of conversation.
"You were too young to remember."
Apparently judging his mood, Rosalind didn't press for a more descriptive answer, and he was thankful for it. A flash of lightning offered him another glimpse of the figure below. The young lady emerged from under a curtain of branches, but before she could break free from her cover, a branch snagged a curl atop her head. Busily, she worked it free, then leapt behind a tall hedge. He shook his head.
"Tell me, have any of our guests gone missing?"
With a grumble, Rosalind folded her arms across her chest.
"You're bored,"
she said over her shoulder, ignoring him.
"This could have been enjoyable for you had you bothered to pick one for yourself."
His hands tightened on the railing.
"There is a woman down there I would like you to make certain we invite,"
he replied, indicating the garden with a nod of his head. Turning, Rosalind placed her hands on her hips and eyed him speculatively.
"Down there? 'Tis done, Gabriel. I just picked the last of the 7.
"Then make it 8. I must have this one."
Rosalind tried peeking above his shoulder, even hopped twice to see over, but to no avail. With a small sisterly shove, she pushed in front of him for an unobstructed view of the garden. As if on command, the young lady peeked out from behind the hedge. Either she'd grown 6 feet tall, Gabriel thought with a reluctant grin, or she had made use of the stone bench to peek over the top of the hedge.
"Ooh,"
Rosalind almost crooned.
"Miss Madelyn Haywood has caught your interest?"
Haywood? Why did that name stand out in his mind? She wasn't that half-American maladroit miss who lived her life teetering on the edge of social disaster, was she? Their domineering Aunt Eugenia had specifically ordered the chit removed from the list, and he had heartily agreed. Rosalind straightened her spine, a knowing smile dancing upon her lips.
"You will be pleased to know I have already invited—"
"Your Grace, my lady!"
Mr. Ashton called out from down the hall before running into Gabriel's study. His solicitor's shoes were caked in mud, smeared on the sides where he obviously attempted to wipe them off in haste.
"I beg your pardon, Your Grace,"
Ashton said before pausing to catch his breath, his bald head gleaming in the firelight.
"The last invitee. She eludes me, sir. I cannot believe it myself, but I almost think, I believe—"
"Spit it out, Ashton."
Gabriel nearly growled.
"Well, she's running from me. I don't understand it myself. To think she doesn't want, that she feels compelled to run. How dare she?"
"How indeed."
Shrugging on his black frock coat, Gabriel plucked the invitation from Mr. Ashton's grasp, then tucked it into his inside coat pocket and headed out of the room.
"If you'll excuse me, Rosalind. And thank you, Ashton,"
he said distractedly over his shoulder at the doorway.
"I'll manage this little minx myself."
A sharp crack of thunder clapped in the distance, followed by a deep, earth-trembling rumble. Madelyn felt its resonance through her thin satin slippers and upward through her bones. The former gentle breeze was now steadily rising, swirling leaves around her in twirls of air. After fighting with a sweeping branch for the possession of the hairs piled atop her head, she stepped out from under the willow, certain that Mr. Ashton had given up hope of ever finding her, and even more certain that standing under a tree was the surest way to get lightning to strike it. What a disaster! Her knee throbbed terribly from her fall, so she hobbled over to a stone bench on the other side of a tall hedge. Lifting her hem, she stepped atop the bench to peer over. Relieved to discover that Mr. Ashton had indeed apparently given up the chase, she plopped down, cringing as she felt the cool stone dampen her backside through the thin fabric of her gown. She let out a small laugh as she noted her appearance. It gave the impression ruffians had accosted her. Her hair had come loose of its chignon, and fat burgundy locks hung down in her face and curled around her shoulders. There was a tear in her mud-dotted hem, and her shoes were soaked through. She turned her gloved hands over in her lap and saw growing red speckles of blood seeping through small snags in the fabric, surely from catching herself on the stones. Her stepmother was going to kill her. If not for eluding an invitation to Wolverest, then surely for ruining her dress. As she lifted the hem of the gown to inspect her knee, she heard a shuffling sound, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Someone was approaching. She sprang from her seat, clutching the unripe lemon in her palm. A man emerged from behind the hedge at the exact moment a flash of lightning speared through the sky. Pulling back her arm, she launched the hard lemon in the air, nailing her target square in the forehead. He stumbled back.
What the hell was that?
Madelyn stared at the tall shadow, her eyes adjusting, focusing on wide shoulders, wind-tossed black hair, thick bangs tumbling forward and nearly reaching his high cheekbones. He was dressed almost entirely in black except for the stark white of his cravat and shirt. She leaned forward, peering into the shadows. Why, he rather looked like he'd stepped from the pages of one of those Gothic novels Charlotte's nose was always buried in. He looked familiar, but she couldn't place him. Unfortunately, she did know for certain he was not Mr. Ashton.
Oh, no,
She groaned.
And good evening to you, Miss Haywood.
He said with a slight bow of his head, his sultry mouth tugging into a smile. A glint of silver brought her attention to his eyes. His gaze was so direct, so soul-reaching she imagined he could read her thoughts. She took a backward step.
Good evening.
Unexpectedly, the pain in her knee throbbed and her footing faltered. She stumbled forward. He caught her at the shoulders.
Are you hurt?
He asked, his deep voice a thick whisper.
Ah, 'tis nothing. A scrape on my knee is all.
She shivered as the heat from his hot hands fairly scorched the skin of her naked shoulders. He guided her back onto the bench, his face so indecently close to hers she could feel the heat from his body on her cheeks, across her collarbone, everywhere.
Better?
He asked once she was settled. She nodded, watching him closely. His serious gaze dipped to her bodice and wavered there for a moment before rising up to drift across her neck, her cheek, her hair, and finally returning to her eyes. His perusal wasn't disapproving nor a predatory leer, but more of a general inventory of her appearance. Still, the heat of embarrassment inflamed her skin. She must look simply horrid.
I must confess,
He replied, looking to the sky and squinting against the wind.
this is a peculiar spot to find one of the guests, considering the state of the weather. May I ask what you're doing out here? That is, besides hurling objects at unsuspecting wanderers.
Oh, I thought you were someone else.
A walking bullseye.
He suggested with half a smile.
You've quite impeccable aim. You're a terribly brilliant archer, I presume.
Oh, you're half right. Just terrible, I'm afraid.
I don't believe you.
He said, rubbing his forehead. She laughed. So did he. A deep masculine rumble that rolled through her like the thunder had earlier. The sound of their mixed voices made her feel warm and strangely giddy. Silence stretched between them and her smile fell away as she stared up into this man's glorious face. His sun-kissed cheeks were taut, his strong jaw bearing the slightest shadow of bristles. A small voice inside her head warned of the dangers of talking to handsome men in moonlit gardens. Alone, she stood abruptly.
If you'll excuse me, my stepmother must be looking for me, and I believe quite another storm is brewing.
Good Lord, the man was making her stutter.
Indeed, Mr. Ashton is looking for you as well.
I haven't the faintest idea why.
She lied. His expression turned stern.
I believe you've been invited to Wolverest.
How did you know my name?
Pardon?
When you called me by my name after I threw the lemon.
Was that what it was? I was quite sure it was some sort of rock.
How did you know my name?
She urged once again, suppressing a smile. He clasped his hands behind his back, rocking on his heels as he studied her with a cool, assessing gaze.
It wasn't hard to deduce, I'm afraid. You've made yourself quite memorable with the guests.
The solicitor had been shouting it across the ballroom and through the garden. She hadn't realised until now the gravity of the scandal she had caused. Madelyn blushed, looking to the ground. Why did she always let her emotions provoke her actions? A charged silence fell between them. Words jumbled up in her mouth to fill the awkward silence with something, anything. But she bit her tongue, unwilling to fall victim to nervous babbling. The smooth edge of the bench brushed against the back of her knees, but to take a step forward would put her directly under his chin. He stood indecently close, and she wondered if he was aware of it, if he did it on purpose to intimidate her.
Have you no desire to attend the Devine ball?
He asked, his tone mildly curious.
No,
she blurted out, right before good sense told her to keep her opinions to herself. His eyes narrowed in apparent disbelief.
Come now. Doesn't everyone want a chance to be a duchess? An exalted peeress of the realm?
It is not a matter of whether or not one wants to be a duchess, but rather one of principle.
He raised a dark eyebrow.
And what principle would that be?
That innocent young ladies should not consort with wolves,
she murmured.
Indeed.
He leaned in closer, an ebony lock falling over one eye.
And you believe the Devine men are both wolves, then?
Good Lord, he looked like a gentleman pirate.
No,
she continued in a whisper, ignoring a foreign stirring deep within her body.
It's my opinion that the Duke is the worse of the two.
The Duke?
He straightened, his eyes flashing with surprise.
And why is that?
Arrogance.
And you believe Lord Tristan is absolved from this sin? The lad has proclaimed he'll not settle for a woman looking any less beautiful than the goddess of Venus herself.
She shrugged.
Simply a case of a younger sibling aping the disposition of the elder. The inclination is a common one, I'm afraid.
She added, nodding. His expression darkened as his intent gaze fairly fastened her to the bench.
Tell me, Miss Haywood, what makes the Duke worse in your eyes?
Only that this bride hunt event, this game, is by his design.
She raised her chin.
Pray, sir, what manner of man thinks nothing of herding a group of young harmless women to his private estate like we were nothing more than prize sheep? The nerve, I say.
Indeed.
I shan't be surprised if the Duke surveys them all with a monocle and gives them all an assessing pinch as they cross his threshold.
He nodded slowly, his mouth turned downward, as if actually contemplating the very thing. Regret zinged through Madelyn for painting such a vivid picture. He cleared his throat and offered calmly.
Perhaps he's being creative.
Or,
she countered,
perhaps he finds some absurd pleasure in having so much power, when any other man holding the same contest would be ostracized from society simply for being...
Yes?
Cork-brained.
Her comment prompted a funny sort of sound from him, like a cough shrouding a chuckle. Madelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. Talk of the Duke's impertinence had clearly unnerved her more than she would have liked to admit. Silence stretched before them as her pulse thudded back to a more sedate pace. Abruptly, he knelt down on one knee before her, as if about to offer his love in a heartfelt proposal. She stared wide-eyed at the top of his dark head as his assessing gaze slowly rose up the length of her body, finally meeting her blinking eyes.
Sir?
May I?
May you what?
She gulped.
Assess the injury to your knee?
No.
She plopped back down on the bench, clamping her hands atop her knees. The motion sent stinging shards across her wounded palms. She cringed. He noticed. Gently, he turned her hands over in her lap, his broad shoulders blocking out the rest of the world.
You're bleeding,
he said, as he started to peel off her gloves with his long, tapered fingers. Madelyn gasped and pulled her hands away.
I assure you I am well.
She adjusted her gloves. He waited silently for her to finish, then pulled out a handkerchief from the inside pocket of his coat and softly placed it into her palm.
Come, allow me to escort you to the kitchen entrance and have my staff take a look at you.
Your staff?
He opened his mouth to respond, pausing for a moment, as if carefully selecting his words.
No, that would be Wolverest staff, of course. I'm afraid I never introduced myself. I'm Gabriel Devine.
Her eyes narrowed. Perhaps this was why his face had appeared familiar to her. Wolverest's family name was Devine, and they were known for their dark, exotic looks. She blinked up at him.
Mr. Devine, is it?
Came his noncommittal reply. With his hand cupping her elbow, he assisted her to stand.
And perhaps you'll want someone to attend to your hair before rejoining the party,
he drawled, his gaze flicking to the top of her head. Bringing up his hand, he froze, hesitating in the act of reaching for her hair. His features sharpened in a contemplative frown, and he sighed, a strange mix of resignation and gruffness. It appeared he'd come to some sort of private decision. Tentatively, he looped one of her heavy curls around his finger and tried tucking it back atop her head. It resisted his urging and bounced back to the middle of her forehead. Apparently determined to bring it under control, he tried once again and ended up with the same result. For a moment, his eyes twinkled warmly with the reflection of the moonlight. Madelyn forgot to breathe. No wonder the Devines were so sought after. Up close, whilst this particular Devine studied her untidy curls with his beautiful face, logical thought did not process. Truth be told, if he bent down to kiss her, she might do the unthinkable and go limp within his arms like a wet goose. Distant thunder rumbled like a boulder rolling down a hillside. She knew she should act more demure, that her gaze shouldn't be so direct. Only she was quite certain he meant to tell her something but thought better of it. He shook his head, barely, and the spell cast between them broke.
The invitees will be announced shortly,
he said quietly.
Once they're publicly declared, there's no turning back.
He looked away, a muscle working in his throat as he swallowed. Taking her hand, he linked her arm with his and led her toward the back of the mansion. To Madelyn's relief, the clouds waited until they reached the door before soaking the earth again. Mr. Devine turned to bid her farewell as soon as they stepped inside. Gently, he took hold of her fingertips and kissed the air above her knuckles. His smile was tight, polite, as if she were already dismissed. Using the light from the bright fire in the kitchen hearth, Madelyn discerned the colour of his eyes, an uncommon shade of sparkling blue, offset by an outer ring of dark blue. How did anyone manage to concentrate under his attention? They were quite utterly mesmerizing. Thinking of her own brown eyes, she was almost envious.
Thank you,
she said finally. His smile fell away, his gaze serious, distant.
No,
he said, his pensive gaze caressing her face, his mind clearly in another place.
Thank you for being so refreshing.
Blinking, she jolted out of the heady enchantment. He thought her refreshing. A greedy swallow of cool lemonade after eating a dry biscuit was refreshing. Had she gone around the bend? What had she expected? That their shared glance was akin to love at first sight? The man was simply being courteous. Was she such a green girl to consider any show of kindness from a handsome man to mean he was enamoured of her? Annoyed with herself, she broke into a polite grin of her own. At her smile, he turned, gesturing to a young maid whom he introduced as Anne. He proceeded to bark a few orders to the staff about what was to be done for Madelyn's comfort. Catching the cook by a tap on her elbow, he pulled her aside, murmuring in her ear. At the cook's nod, he turned and left the room. If the servants were at all surprised to find Mr. Devine in the Duke of Wolverest's kitchen distributing orders, they made no mention of it. They bustled about, placing glasses of wine on silver trays and arranging various sugared cakes on plates and three-tiered servers. Others folded linen napkins, far from where the cook stood, merrily rolling dough onto a large work table. The plump, rosy-cheeked woman looked perfectly happy to have all the organised chaos zipping around her kitchen. Anne urged Madelyn to sit on a stool at one end of the table so she could take care of the wounds to her palms.
"Oh, miss, I see you'll be leaving in a se'nnight."
Madelyn returned her attention to Anne.
Pardon?
"Wolverest Castle, miss."
Anne replied.
"You'll be sure to have a grand time, if I may say so. The grounds are quite lovely."
She unfolded the handkerchief Mr. Devine had pressed into Madelyn's palm in the garden.
"There's an orangery, a splendid topiary garden, and a gleaming ballroom fit for a—"
Anne continued to speak, but Madelyn was no longer listening. Glancing down, she groaned. Tucked inside was the invitation Mr. Ashton had failed to present himself. Exasperated, she shook her head.
Oh, that Mr. Devine.
"Mr. Devine?"
Anne asked, wide-eyed.
Yes.
Madelyn said.
'Twas his name, no?
Anne gasped as the cook bustled past, elbowing her in the ribs.
Yes, of course, Miss Haywood. Mr. Devine, he is—"
she rasped, rubbing her side. Trailing her fingertip across the red wax seal, Madelyn whispered to the now blushing maid.
He's as sly as a fox.
"Aye, miss. That he is."
What is, Papa?